They called him the Ghost of the Plains. The name had started as a joke among the ranch hands who once worked the land neighboring his, but after so many years, it became more truth than tease. Eli Cartwright hadn't been seen in town for almost a decade. The local storekeeper swore that every few months a letter marked Cartwright Ranch arrived at his shop, along with a list of supplies and a few carefully folded bills. By morning, the crate would vanish from behind the shop's back door, the money always exact, never a penny short. Nobody ever saw who took it. Some said he came at night. Others said it wasn't a man at all, just the wind that swept through and claimed what it needed. The ranch itself stretched far and wide across the Montana plains, where the earth met the sky in endless loneliness. The house stood on a rise, wood weathered gray by decades of wind and sun, its porch sagging, its windows blind with dust. There was no light there after sunset, no laughter, no music, no human sound, only the faint creak of wood when the wind pressed against it, and the whisper of long grass brushing against the fence posts. It was the kind of silence that could swallow a man whole. Eli lived in that silence. He didn't mind it, at least that's what he told himself. He rose before dawn, brewed his coffee strong enough to burn, and fed his horse Dusty, who had grown old beside him. Every creak of the barn, every flap of the chicken coop door, every gust of prairie wind had become his rhythm. He spoke to no one but the animals, and even then his words were few. "Easy, girl," he'd murmur to Dusty as he saddled her. "Stay close." That was all. In the evenings after the work was done, Eli sat on his porch, the horizon stretching endlessly in front of him. Sometimes he'd take out his harmonica and let it sing low, the sound trembling and sad like a ghost calling another ghost. He didn't remember when he'd last smiled. He didn't try to. Life had become something to endure, not enjoy. He wasn't always that way. Once, Eli Cartwright was known as a man with a full laugh, a good heart, and a family that made the lonely land feel alive. But that was before the fire, the one that took his wife Mary and their little boy Luke. The ranch had caught in the middle of a dry summer when a lightning strike set the barn ablaze. By the time Eli reached the house, the roof was collapsing. He had tried. God, he had tried, but the smoke was too thick, the heat too fierce. He could still remember Mary's scream, the way it cracked in the air before being swallowed by the flames. He never forgave himself for living when they didn't. After the fire, he buried them on the ridge overlooking the plains and left the world behind. The town sent letters, the pastor came once or twice, but Eli never answered. He rebuilt the ranch by himself, one wall at a time, one fence at a time. He didn't want company. He didn't want pity. He wanted silence because silence didn't ask questions. The years blurred together. Winters came with biting wind that whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and summers baked the ground until the soil split open. He didn't notice anymore. The seasons passed and Eli endured. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in the wind, his wife calling his name, his son laughing in the barnyard, but when he turned, there was nothing there. It was a night like that, a storm building, the air thick and heavy, that something changed. The wind began to howl across the plains, pushing dust and grit against the windows. The sky had turned an ugly shade of greenish gray, and the first drops of rain hit the porch like thrown pebbles. Eli had been mending a bridle when he heard the rumble of thunder rolling far off. He moved slowly as he always did, gathering the horses into the stable and locking the barn doors tight. He could smell rain and distant lightning, that strange metallic tang that carried through the air before the sky opened up. When he stepped back into the house, the storm hit full force. The rain came sideways, slamming against the wooden walls. Eli lit his lantern, the flame flickering as the wind forced its way through the cracks. He sat by the fire, staring at the flames, the old ache in his chest pressing heavier than usual. It was on nights like this, when the world seemed to rage outside, that he remembered how it had felt. The screams, the fire, the helplessness. He shut his eyes and pressed his hand to his face, willing the memories away. Then came the sound. At first he thought it was just the storm. A thud, maybe a branch thrown against the door. But then he heard it again, softer but deliberate. A knock. Eli froze. No one knocked on his door. No one had for years. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from years of solitude, and reached for the rifle propped by the fireplace. The knock came again, this time weaker. A voice followed, a woman's voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Please, is anyone there?" Eli's breath caught. For a long moment, he didn't move. He wasn't sure if it was real or if the storm was playing tricks on him. But then came another knock, fainter still. He crossed the room, the floorboards groaning under his boots. He unlatched the door and opened it a crack, the wind bursting in like a living thing. She was kneeling there in the mud, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, her hands shaking. The lantern light fell across her features, young, maybe 20, with eyes wide from fear and exhaustion. Her clothes were torn, one sleeve ripped open, her face streaked with dirt. "Please," she gasped, her voice breaking. "They're after me." Eli didn't speak at first. His mind was trying to understand after her. Who? Why here? He looked past her into the darkness, but the rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet. He lowered the rifle slightly. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She shook her head weakly. "Please, I just need shelter." Eli hesitated. He had spent years shutting the world out, guarding his silence like a wounded animal. Letting her in meant opening the door, to danger, to the unknown, to memories he'd spent years burying. But when he looked at her again, trembling in the rain, something in his chest softened. Maybe it was the way her eyes pleaded, or maybe it was the echo of another night long ago when his wife had begged him to hurry, to save them, and he hadn't been fast enough. He stepped aside. "Come in." The girl almost collapsed as she crossed the threshold. Eli caught her by the arm and guided her toward the fire. Her hands were ice cold. He pulled a blanket from the chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. She sat trembling, eyes fixed on the flames as if afraid they'd disappear. For a long time, neither spoke. The storm howled outside, the rain hammering against the roof. Eli poured her a mug of hot coffee, and she took it in both hands, sipping slowly. Her lips were pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Name's Eli," he said quietly. "You got one?" "Clara," she murmured after a pause. "Clara Reed. Where you from, Clara Reed?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window as thunder cracked overhead. "South near Pine Hollow. I was traveling north with a wagon. We were attacked 2 days ago." "Attacked?" Eli repeated, his voice low. She nodded. "Outlaws. 3 of them. They took everything, our horses, supplies. I ran, I thought I'd lost them, but..." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "I saw one of them again tonight, near the river. I ran as fast as I could. Then the storm hit." Eli leaned back, his jaw tight. He knew the kind. Bands of desperate men who roamed the plains, preying on the lost and the weak. He also knew that if one of them had followed her this far, trouble was close behind. "You're safe here," he said finally. The words came out rough but steady. "Ain't nobody gonna harm you under my roof." Clara looked up at him, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then moved to the window, peering out into the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the endless plains in ghostly white. For a brief second he thought he saw movement, something dark shifting near the fence line, but when he blinked it was gone. Just shadows and wind. Still he kept the rifle within reach. Behind him, Clara had fallen asleep by the fire, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Her breathing was soft, steady, the exhaustion of fear finally giving way to rest. Eli watched her for a moment, something unfamiliar stirring inside him. It had been so long since he'd heard another person breathe under his roof. He turned back to the window. The rain was easing now, the thunder rolling farther away, but he didn't sleep. Not that night. He stood by the door until dawn, the rifle in his hand, watching the dark plains for any sign of the men who had chased her. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridge and the whispering fields, danger was waiting. But for the first time in 15 years, Eli Cartwright wasn't alone, and as the first pale light of morning spilled across the horizon, brushing the land in silver and gold, he felt something flicker inside him, something small and dangerous and long forgotten. Hope. When Eli woke the next morning, the first thing he noticed was the light, the soft, golden wash of dawn slipping through the cracks in the window shutters. The second thing he noticed was the silence. Not the familiar kind, the empty silence that had hung over his ranch for years like an old ghost, but a different kind, gentler, fuller. He could hear the faint crackle of dying embers in the fireplace, the rustle of fabric as Clara stirred under the blanket he'd laid across her the night before. He sat quietly at the table, sipping his coffee, watching her sleep. In the early light, her face looked softer, less haunted than it had when she'd stumbled through his door. Her hair, once plastered to her face by the rain, had dried. Eli looked away before she opened her eyes. It had been too long since he'd had company, longer still since that company had been a woman. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. Words felt like tools he hadn't used in years, dull and rusted. When she did wake, she blinked at the light, confusion flickering across her features before recognition settled in. She looked around the cabin, then at him. "You stayed up," she said softly. Eli grunted. "Didn't sleep much." She sat up, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. "I didn't mean to trouble you. I should have kept moving," he set his mug down. "You'd be dead if you had. That storm wasn't kind to anyone last night." Clara's lips curved into something between a smile and a sigh. "Maybe you're right." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for letting me in." He nodded once. Anyone would have, but they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger in the middle of nowhere, especially a man like Eli Cartwright, whose soul had been buried with his past. Yet something had made him do it, something he didn't care to name. Clara tried to stand but winced as she put weight on her ankle. Eli noticed her limp immediately. "You hurt?" "Twisted it," she admitted. "When I ran from the river." He rose, fetched a small tin from the shelf, and crouched beside her. "Hold still." Clara blinked, surprised, as he dipped his rough fingers into the salve and gently rubbed it around the swelling. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as though he were afraid she might shatter beneath his hands. She flinched at the coldness of the ointment but didn't pull away. "You're used to helping people," she said after a moment. Eli paused, his gaze fixed on her ankle. "Used to be. What happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and replaced the tin on the shelf. "You'll be fine by tomorrow," he muttered. "Best stay off it for today." She studied him in silence. There was something about the way he spoke, as if every word was weighed before it was released, as if speech itself cost him. She sensed there were stories behind his quietness, long buried and raw, but she didn't press him. By midday, the storm had passed, leaving the plains washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and sagebrush, and sunlight shimmered in the puddles scattered across the dirt yard. Eli went about his chores, mending the broken gate and checking the cattle. Clara insisted on helping despite her limp, and though he grumbled about it, he didn't send her back inside. She carried the pails, fed the chickens, and even managed a small smile when Dusty, Eli's old horse, nuzzled her shoulder. "She's beautiful," Clara said, running her hand down the mare's neck. "Old as sin, stubborn too," Eli said, but there was fondness in his tone. "Reminds me of someone," Clara teased lightly. Eli shot her a look but didn't answer. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as if he were fighting back a smile. They worked in silence for a while. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, unspoken understanding. Two people who had both been chased by ghosts of different kinds, finding themselves by some strange mercy on the same stretch of land. Later, over supper, beans and cornbread, they sat across from each other at the rough wooden table. Eli hadn't used both plates in years. The sight of them, 2 cups, 2 forks, 2 bowls, stirred something deep in him. It felt wrong and right at the same time. "Do you live here alone?" Clara asked. "Been that way a long while?" "No family?" He looked up, his eyes sharp for a moment, then softened. "Used to have one." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Eli nodded, but he didn't meet her eyes. "Ain't your fault." They ate in silence after that. Outside, the sky turned pink, then gold, then the kind of deep violet that made the plains look endless. Eli cleared the dishes and Clara stood to help. He started to protest, but she shook her head. "I need to move around. I can't just sit still," so he let her. They washed in silence, the sound of running water filling the space between them. When they were done, she looked around the small cabin. The tools neatly hung on the wall, the faded photograph on the mantel, the single rocking chair by the fire. Her gaze lingered on the picture, a woman with kind eyes and a little boy grinning beside her. "Your family?" she asked softly. Eli froze where he stood. Clara swallowed. "They're gone?" He nodded once. "Fire long time ago." "I'm sorry," she said again. And this time the words came from somewhere deeper, as if she understood the kind of pain that doesn't fade, only settles in your bones. Eli didn't respond. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening horizon. You should rest. Tomorrow I'll take you to the nearest town. You can find a wagon heading north. Clara hesitated. What if they're still out there? He turned back toward her. Then they'll have to go through me first. The words hung in the air, heavy and certain. Clara wanted to believe him. Something about the way he said it, the calm authority in his voice, made her feel safer than she'd felt in days. She nodded and went to her cot near the fire. But sleep didn't come easily. Neither of them slept much that night. Eli sat on the porch, a lantern beside him, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind move through the grass. The night was still except for the occasional cry of a coyote far off. His thoughts wandered back to the woman sleeping inside his cabin. Something about her presence unsettled him, stirred memories he'd buried deep. Mary used to sit by that same fire, humming while she mended shirts. Their boy used to laugh outside, chasing the chickens with a stick. Eli had thought those sounds were gone forever, replaced by silence. But now with Clara here, the silence had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. At dawn, Eli saddled Dusty and packed the wagon. Clara emerged from the cabin, her hair braided, her face pale but resolute. You sure about this? She asked, looking out toward the horizon. He nodded. You'll be safer in town. As they rode, the landscape stretched endlessly before them. Rolling grass, scattered rocks, the occasional distant hawk circling high above. The sun rose behind them, turning the world to gold. For a while they didn't speak. Then Clara broke the silence. You don't talk much, do you? Eli glanced at her. Ain't much to say. I don't believe that, she said. People always have something to say. They just forget how. He looked ahead, jaw tight. Some things are better left buried. Clara nodded slowly. Maybe, but sometimes the things we bury don't stay buried forever. Eli didn't answer, but her words lingered. They reached a small stream by midday and stopped to rest. Clara sat by the water, watching it ripple around her fingers. I used to live near a river like this, she said. My father taught me how to fish when I was little. Said if you were patient enough, the river always gave back. Eli watched her for a long moment. Did it? She smiled faintly. Not always, but I learned to wait. He found himself looking at her differently then, not as a burden or a stranger, but as something else entirely. Someone who understood waiting. Someone who knew what it meant to lose and still keep going. When they reached the crossroads that evening, Eli reined in the horse. Town's 6 miles that way, he said, nodding toward the north road. You'll find folks who can help. Clara looked at the horizon, then back at him. And you'll go back to your ranch? He nodded. She bit her lip, hesitating. I could stay a few more days. Help you with the fences, maybe. You shouldn't be alone out there. Eli frowned. I've been alone a long time. That doesn't mean you should stay that way. The wind rustled the tall grass around them. Eli didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that loneliness wasn't something you chose. It was something that claimed you, quietly, like frost creeping over glass. But before he could answer, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement near the ridge. A rider. He tensed, reaching for his rifle. Clara followed his gaze and went pale. It's them, she whispered. Get down. Eli hissed, pulling her behind the wagon. The rider was still distant but moving fast. Eli could see the glint of a revolver at his hip. Stay here, he said. And before she could protest, he mounted Dusty and rode forward. The rider slowed when he saw Eli approach. Morning, old man, the stranger called out, voice slick and cruel. You happen to see a girl pass through here last night? Small, dark hair, might have been running scared. Eli's grip tightened on the reins. Ain't seen anyone. The man smirked. That's so. Shame. She's a thief. Took something that don't belong to her. Eli stared at him, expression unreadable. Don't reckon I care what she took. The man's smirk faded. You sure about that? Eli's voice was calm, but there was iron underneath it. Get off my land. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then the man spat into the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off, muttering something under his breath. Eli watched until the figure disappeared into the hills. When he returned to the wagon, Clara was trembling. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "If he comes back, then he'll wish he hadn't," Eli said simply. She stared at him for a long time, then nodded. "You're not what I expected, Eli Cartwright." He looked at her, brow furrowed. "What did you expect?" "A ghost," she said softly. "But you're still alive." The words hit him harder than she could have known. That night, back at the ranch, the wind carried the scent of rain again. Clara sat by the fire, humming quietly, and Eli found himself listening. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt lived in, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew something had changed. The ghosts had not vanished, but maybe, just maybe, they'd made room for something new to grow among the ashes. The days stretched quietly after that morning at the crossroads. Clara stayed. She never said exactly why, and Eli never asked. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he was afraid that asking would break whatever fragile thread had begun to weave between them. The plains softened with spring. The snowmelt fed. The streams, the grass returned to green, and the air smelled of earth and rain. For the first time in years, Eli felt the rhythm of life again, not just the endless repetition of chores, but something human, something alive. Clara became part of it without trying. She woke early, just after dawn, and moved through the ranch like she had always belonged there. She fed the chickens, milked the old cow that Eli had nearly given up on, and hummed softly to herself while sweeping the porch. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the still morning air like sunlight through dust. Eli pretended not to listen, but he always did. In the evenings, they would sit outside when the light turned honey gold and the world slowed down. Clara would talk, mostly about small things: the taste of the cornbread she'd made, the strange sound of coyotes at night, the stars that looked close enough to touch. Eli didn't talk much, but when he did, it was usually about the land, the weather, the cattle, the fences. Yet somehow their conversations didn't need words. Sometimes, when she laughed, he would look up from his work and feel something catch in his chest. It was small and painful, like remembering a song you'd forgotten you loved. He didn't understand it, and he didn't fight it. One evening, after they'd finished supper, Clara leaned her elbows on the table and looked at him across the flickering firelight. "You never told me what brought you here," she said. Eli froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. "This place," she went on softly. "It's beautiful, but lonely. You don't strike me as the kind of man who ran from the world without a reason." He set the fork down, staring at the flame. "There was a reason," he said. "What was it?" He hesitated, then looked at her. Her eyes were steady, gentle but not pitying. He could tell she wasn't asking to pry, she was asking to understand. He exhaled slowly. "I had a family once. Wife and a boy, Mary and Luke." The names felt strange in his mouth, like foreign words spoken for the first time in years. "There was a fire. Took the barn first, then the house. I tried to get him out, but..." His voice faltered. "They didn't make it." Clara's expression softened, her fingers tightening around the mug in her hands. "I'm sorry, Eli." He nodded. "It was a long time ago, but some things don't stay in the past." The wind pressed against the windows, the flames flickering. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand on his. Her fingers were small and warm, and he didn't pull away. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said quietly. He looked at her, really, looked at her, the glow of the firelight on her skin, the faint sadness in her smile, the way her eyes seemed older than her years. There was something in her gaze that mirrored his own pain, something that whispered of loss and survival. That night, after she went to bed, Eli sat on the porch long after the fire had gone cold. The stars stretched endless above him. For the first time since Mary and Luke's deaths, he whispered their names aloud. The sound didn't hurt as much as he expected. It felt like letting go of a breath he'd been holding for years. Days passed, and their lives fell into an easy rhythm. They rode together across the land, checking fences and herding cattle. Clara learned quickly how to tie a proper knot, how to steady a horse, how to handle a lasso without tangling herself in it. Eli watched her, half amused, half amazed. She was tough, but she moved with a kind of quiet grace he hadn't seen before. One afternoon, as they worked near the stream, Clara looked up at him and grinned. "You ever smiled, Eli Cartwright?" He squinted at her from under his hat. "Don't reckon I've had much reason to." "Well," she said, shading her eyes against the sun, "maybe it's time you found one." He didn't answer, but later as they rode home side by side, she caught a flicker of something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make her heart lift. The nights grew warmer. They started sitting outside later and later, talking under the stars. Clara told him about her life before, the small town near Pine Hollow, the wagon her family had used to travel west, the way she'd loved to read stories by lantern light. She never mentioned her family beyond that, and Eli didn't ask. He knew the tone of her voice when she spoke of loss. One night she found the old harmonica sitting on the mantel. "You play?" she asked. Eli shrugged. "Used to." "Play for me," she said, smiling. He hesitated, then took it in his rough hands. It had been years since he'd touched it. When he brought it to his lips, the first note came out cracked and shaky. But soon the melody found its way, soft, aching, filled with longing. Clara closed her eyes and listened, her hand resting on the windowsill. The music drifted through the open door and out into the night, echoing across the fields like a memory returning home. When he stopped, there were tears in her eyes. "That was beautiful," she whispered. Eli looked down at the harmonica. Mary used to say that song made the stars shine brighter. Then she was right, Clara said, and smiled through her tears. It became their quiet ritual. Every few nights he would play and she would sit and listen. The sound wove through, the silence of the ranch, softening the walls that had long held only grief. But peace never lasts long on the plains. It started with the tracks, fresh ones near the edge of the property. Eli found them one morning, deep boot prints cutting through the mud. He studied them for a long time, his gut tightening. They weren't his, and they sure as hell weren't Clara's. When he told her, she went pale. "Could be one of your outlaws," he said carefully. "The ones that attacked your wagon." Clara looked away, biting her lip. Maybe, he pressed. "You sure there's not something I ought to know?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's just, they don't give up easy." Eli didn't like that answer. For the rest of the day, he kept his rifle close, scanning the horizon. But no one came. A few quiet days passed, and life returned to something that felt almost normal. Yet Eli could sense the tension in her. She laughed less. She startled easily at every distant sound. Sometimes he caught her staring out toward the ridge where the graves were, the ones he'd shown her when they'd been riding one afternoon. She always looked at them with a strange kind of reverence, as if she already knew them. Then one morning she was gone. Eli woke to find her bed empty, her hat left on the chair, her few belongings missing. He called her name, his voice echoing through the stillness. No answer. The coffee pot was still warm, the back door slightly ajar. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his chest. He saddled Dusty and followed the faint trail of footprints leading east toward the ridge. The sun was still low, painting the land in long shadows. As he rode, he thought of all the things he'd wanted to say to her but never had. He'd told himself he didn't need anyone anymore, that loneliness was safer than loss. But Clara had changed that. She'd walked into his silence and filled it with life. He couldn't lose that again. He wouldn't. When he reached the ridge, he saw her. She was standing near the 3 weathered gravestones that marked the resting place of his wife and son. Her shawl fluttered in the wind. Eli slowed his horse, his heart hammering. "Clara?" She turned at the sound of his voice. There were tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He dismounted, walking toward her. "Sorry for what?" "For leaving. For not telling you the truth." He stopped a few paces away, the wind tugging at his coat. What truth? Clara took a deep breath. Your wife, Mary? She was my mother's sister. Eli froze. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. What did you say? She was my aunt, Clara said, voice trembling. My mother used to tell me stories about her. About the man she married, the ranch they built. When I heard what happened, I wanted to find this place. I didn't know if you were still alive, but when I found you, I couldn't tell you. Not yet. Eli stared at her, unable to speak. The wind whistled through the grass around them. I came because I needed to know what kind of man could survive losing everything, Clara whispered. I thought I was looking for answers, but what I found was more than that. Her eyes shimmered. I found family. Eli's throat tightened. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was afraid, she said. Afraid you'd send me away? Afraid it would hurt you to know. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. You think I haven't been hurt enough? Clara looked down, tears sliding down her cheeks. I didn't mean to cause you more pain. Eli stood there for a long time looking at her. The niece of the woman he'd loved more than life. The last living thread of a family he'd thought was gone forever. Slowly he reached out and touched her shoulder. You brought her back, he said softly. You brought them back. Clara met his gaze, and for a moment the grief and the years between them seemed to dissolve. The sun broke through the clouds then, casting light over the ridge. The gravestones gleamed faintly, the names etched in shadow and gold. Eli felt the ache in his chest ease. Not gone, but gentler, as if the ghost he'd carried for so long had finally found peace. Clara smiled through her tears. I wasn't running from something, Eli. I was running to something. To you. He took her hand, rough against soft, and held it tight. Then you're home, he said. They stood together, the wind whispering through the grass, the sky stretching endless and clear above them. And for the first time in 15 years, Eli Cartwright didn't feel alone.